Welcome back to Daily Harmony. Today we're going to be looking at something that's pretty
Mm,
interesting. We're going to be unpacking A Course in Miracles Lesson 135. If
mm.
I defend myself, I'm attacked.
Wow. Now that is a very provocative statement, isn't it? I mean, it really kind of goes against everything that we're sort of taught to stand up for ourselves.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It seems counterintuitive. I mean, when someone comes at you or criticizes you, I think it's just natural to want to, put up your dukes, defend yourself.
Right. I mean, that's self-preservation, right? That's been with us since the caveman days.
Yeah, it is. It is. But,
Mm.
the goal today is to kind of take this idea and explore it and see, where it leads us.
All right. Sounds good.
And yeah, I think, what we want to really look at is how that very act of defending yourself may actually be a form of attack, not
Mhm.
only on others, but also on yourself. And we'll look at how that stems from the ego and from fear.
Mhm.
We'll give you some practical steps to take to kind of recognize that and deal with it and, talk about some of the benefits that you can receive by, not being so defensive.
Okay, that sounds like a great plan. Let's do it.
All right, so let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with this core concept, this statement that's right there in black and white. If I defend myself, I am attacked. What does that even mean?
Well, I think the Course posits that the very act of defending yourself is a form of attack. And, it's coming from
Mm-hmm.
this place of separation
Mm.
and the emotion of fear. So when you feel like you need to defend yourself against something, it's because you believe that. There's something out there that you need to be protected from.
I see. So it's almost like that instinct, that desire to defend yourself is reinforcing the idea that there's something to be defended against. It's keeping that whole adversarial dynamic, in motion.
That's exactly right.
So it's almost like if you don't need to defend yourself, then there's nothing to attack.
Right. And what's interesting is that the Course talks about how the threats that we perceive aren't necessarily as real as we think they are.
Oh, interesting.
They're often just our own interpretations of things, based on our own thoughts, which are often based on fear.
I see. So it's almost like we're creating our own, boogeymen in a way, and then reacting to them as if they were, genuinely threatening.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And the study guide, the Defense and Attack Study Guide, explains that defending implies that there is something to be protected against, thus perpetuating conflict.
So it's like that act of putting up that shield in your mind is confirming that there's a battle going on. Ah, I see, I see. So if this defensiveness isn't really serving us, then what's at the root of it? Why do we do it so much?
Well, the Course explains that. This stems from the ego, which...
Ah, yes, the ego.
Now, we're not talking about, ego in the sense of like, oh, he has such a huge ego.
Right.
We're talking about that part of our mind that believes in separation.
I see.
The part of our mind that is constantly fostering fear.
Right. So it's that part of us that's, clinging to the idea that we are separate and alone and vulnerable.
Exactly. The ego uses defensiveness as a way to maintain that illusion. It wants to stay in control, and it's constantly trying to protect itself from pain, from hurt, from rejection.
Yeah, from loss.
So it's almost like the ego is, it's got this little fortress built up around it, and it's constantly, on guard, making sure that nothing can penetrate those walls.
Exactly.
So how do we start to, recognize this ego and its defensiveness and maybe start to work with it a little bit differently? Well, I think the first step is to be mindful, to be aware, and to observe your thoughts and emotions as they're arising.
Yeah.
And especially, when you feel like you're getting defensive, to notice that
Yeah.
and to observe it without judgment.
I see. So it's about becoming aware of those, those triggers, those situations that tend to push our buttons and make us feel defensive, and just noticing, how we react internally, physically, emotionally, what's going on in our minds.
But,
So what are some of those signs, those signals that, we might be, shifting into that defensive mode?
well, one is that feeling of a need to justify your actions or your opinions.
Yeah.
To argue your point really strongly.
Right, right. Or maybe, resisting feedback, instead of being open to it, being very quick to point out why the other person is wrong or why they just don't get it.
Yeah, and, interrupting others, jumping in before they're even finished speaking because you feel like you've got to counter what they're saying. And
Yeah.
even sometimes physically, tightening in your shoulders, clenched hands, rapid heart rate.
Those are great, physical signs to kind of keep an eye out for. Those bodily sensations that often accompany those, emotional reactions.
Oh, yeah. And then, when you notice that happening, A good question to ask yourself is, what am I really afraid of?
Well, that's a good one.
What is it that you're so afraid of that you need to defend yourself?
Yeah, because a lot of times, we're not even consciously aware of what those deeper fears are. Are we afraid of being wrong? Are we afraid of being rejected or, looking foolish?
Right. And then another thing you can do is when you're in that situation where you're feeling defensive, is to really try to practice open listening.
Mm. Oh, open listening, yes. Now that can be a really tough one, especially when, our ego is kind of screaming at us to, fight back, to defend our position. But what does it mean to really, practice open listening in those challenging moments?
Well, I think it means that you make a genuine effort to understand the other person's perspective.
Mm.
You try to really listen to what they're saying
Yeah.
and understand, the feelings behind it without planning your rebuttal.
Right. So it's about putting our own, need to be right or to win the argument aside and really trying to step into the other person's shoes and see the world from their perspective.
Exactly.
Because what happens when we do that, when we really make that effort to truly listen?
Well, a lot of times it diffuses the tension.
Mm.
It creates a space for understanding. And, the focus shifts from proving that you're right to connecting with the other person.
Yeah, because ultimately, most of us, we just want to feel heard and understood,
Yeah.
right? And when we can create that space for each other, it can really help to transform those potentially volatile situations.
Exactly.
So to kind of bring this all together and make it really practical, what are some, exercises, some techniques that, our listeners can use during the week to really start incorporating this lesson into their lives?
Well, that mindful observation that we talked about is a great exercise to just, throughout the day, periodically, pause and observe your thoughts and your feelings, especially when you're feeling defensive, and ask yourself, what am I afraid of? What am I afraid of losing? Or what am I afraid of being?
That's great. And I think journaling can be a really powerful tool as well. Maybe take some time this week to reflect on a recent situation where you felt attacked or criticized and just write about it in your journal.
Yeah, write about, what happened and how you reacted,
Yeah.
how you felt. And then once you've gotten all that out, kind of look back on it and
Yeah.
think about how your reaction might have contributed to what happened. Maybe it escalated the situation, or maybe, it created more misunderstanding. And then think about how you could have approached that situation differently. What would it have been like to respond with more openness? And then really try to identify what were the fears that were driving your defensiveness.
That's such a valuable process. And here's a question for you, for everyone listening. To really ponder this week, what would it mean for you personally to release that need to defend yourself? And how do you think that would change your relationships and your own sense of inner peace?
That is a really good question. So as you start to let go of that need to be defensive, what are some of the benefits that you might experience?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is a deeper sense of inner peace. When we're not constantly on guard, bracing ourselves for that next attack or criticism, we can relax a little bit, We can start to move through the world with a little more ease and tranquility.
Yeah, I could see that. It's kind of like, you're walking around with your shoulders all tensed up, and then, you finally realize it and you can, relax and
Yeah.
let go of that tension.
Exactly.
It's like that, but, on an emotional level.
Yeah, exactly. And when we let go of that defensiveness, it also creates space for healing, Instead of constantly trying to protect ourselves from those perceived threats, we can actually start to look at those deeper fears and insecurities that, have been driving that defensiveness in the first place.
Right. And I think, it can really change the way you relate to other people.
How so?
When you're not so focused on being right and defending your ego, it allows you to be more compassionate and understanding. And that just naturally makes you more forgiving, not only of others, but also of yourself.
That's so true, because when we can, approach our interactions with more empathy and understanding, it creates a space for, deeper, more genuine connection. And, ultimately those relationships become more harmonious, more fulfilling. It's all about, moving away from that me versus you mentality and, creating that sense of we're in this together.
Yeah, it's like it breaks down the wall between you and the other person.
Exactly.
So just to summarize for you, what we've learned in this deep dive into Lesson 135 is that defense isn't really protecting you the way you think it is. It stems from fear and it just keeps conflict going. But when you let go of the need to defend yourself it can bring a whole lot more peace and a whole lot more connection into your life.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that, this isn't about being passive or letting people walk all over you. It's about recognizing that a lot of our defensiveness is coming from that ego-driven fear.
Yeah.
And by becoming aware of that, we can start to choose a different way of responding, one that's based on understanding and compassion.
Yeah, and that takes practice.
It does.
It's possible.
It is. It is. So, as you go through this week, we encourage you to really, sit with Lesson 135 and see how this idea of defensiveness shows up in your own life. And, remember those practical tools we talked about. Mindful observation, open listening, journaling, and just see what happens when you start to, experiment with choosing vulnerability over that habitual need to defend.
See you tomorrow.